Hello everyone, my name is Helen Carr and I'm a professor at the Law School at the University of Kent. What I want to talk to you about today is the law and politics of contemporary housing space. If I can preface this talk with a couple of quotations. The first, space is a right, a good in and of itself. And that was said by Owen Hatherley in The Guardian in January 2014. Then, in contrast, from the Department of Communities and Local Government, overall, it is clear that in many respects the market is performing well in the absence of national space standards, and government's preference remains for market-led solutions. So what we see are clear battle lines. On the one side, Owen Hatherley with Shelter, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the left in general, who argue that space is a social good and therefore minimum standards for housing should be set to ensure that people have sufficient room in which to carry out normal daily activities, socialise with their families and friends, work from home or study, and provide storage for household goods and personal belongings. For the other side, predominantly the house building industry, economists and central government, the market provides the best mechanism for rationing space. The Department of Communities and Local Government consultation on housing standards in August 2013 points, for instance, to complexity in the operation of space standards and the implications in terms of construction costs, affordability, and the potential need for larger areas of land to deliver a greater number of homes. What is at stake is ideological and quintessentially urban. In an era of hyper-urbanisation, should law protect people from the consequences of an increasingly competitive and global market for housing space, or is the market the best and perhaps the only place for individuals to flourish? Now, in this presentation, I reflect on the law and politics of housing space underpinning this dilemma. I focus in particular on housing space standards, an attempt by law to provide a universal standard for the size of people's home, simultaneously to mitigate the effects of the market and provide decent housing for workers to meet the needs of that market. I start by considering a contemporary example of the reorganisation of housing space in London, the emergence of high-quality houses in multiple occupation, HMOs. That's the technical label used in the UK for a property where rooms are let out individually, but certain facilities such as bathrooms or kitchens are shared. Traditionally, HMOs are conversions of large Victorian properties on the edges of cities abandoned by families in the early years of the 20th century in the flight to the suburbs. Rents are lower than in self-contained accommodation, and this has consequences. Occupiers are generally single, poor and transient, typically workers on 0 hours contracts or the minimum wage recipient or recent migrants. What they have in common is that expectations of their accommodation are low, and they have an awareness of their limited alternatives. Low rents mean that conditions are poor. Landlords, in order to maintain profit levels, carry out limited maintenance and are tempted to cram into the property as many rental units as possible. As a result, HMOs provide some of the worst housing conditions in the UK. For this reason, New Labour made a manifesto commitment to mandatory licensing of HMOs in 1977, which became law in the Housing Act 2004. Now, one might have expected that the rigour of the regulatory regime introduced by the Housing Act 2004 would have resulted in a dramatic decline in the number of HMOs. However, local authorities have been keen to preserve this as an affordable option, and as house prices have risen more sharply than rent levels, converting houses into HMOs enables landlords to increase rental yields. The Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, in a briefing from 2014, demonstrates that the number of HMOs has risen from 300,000 or so to way over 400,000. It appears there's something distinct about these new HMOs. The Building Research Establishment noted the emergence of high-quality HMOs targeting young, mobile professionals unwilling or unable to access increasingly expensive self-contained housing. Ultimate Housing Limited, which markets itself as the UK's first professional house share provider, is a typical new provider of urban HMOs. Its houses are modern, well equipped, well maintained, with shared kitchens, communal lounges and gardens. There are some shared bathrooms, but others have ensuite facilities. Rooms are equipped with a flat screen TV and Wi-Fi. Double beds are provided if requested by the occupier. They're very well located in what the company describes as the hotspots of South East London. What the properties have in common with the more traditional HMO is the desire of the landlord to maximise profits, and as a result, room sizes and communal areas are small. And this is exacerbated by the fact that these properties now being converted were originally family homes built in the 1980s and 90s, which lack the grand dimensions of their Victorian predecessors. Now, the small size of the rooms in these HMO has led to legal tussles between providers and local authority regulators. The evidence produced by Ultimate Housing during court proceedings was that room sizes were not problematic. There was a strong demand for the rooms from young people who'd just arrived in London, predominantly from South Africa and Australia, looking for work or to study. They wanted to live close to the financial sector with people like themselves and appreciated the ready-made social life that house sharing would offer. The landlord suggested that occupation was temporary, although some had lived in the property for years rather than months, and that most of the occupiers had rooms elsewhere. Now, what does the popularity of this form of housing provision tell us about contemporary urban living? The bodies of these new occupiers packed into small rooms are being disciplined in new ways. Mess has to be avoided. Possessions are minimal and preferably virtual. Somebody with a lot of physical possessions is in some way deviant. It's not the room that's too small, but the occupier lives in the wrong way. Food is perhaps cooked in the communal kitchen, but it's likely to be pre-prepared, heated up and then consumed in their room as in the small dining area. What matters is proximity, not to people, but to facilities, opportunities and employment. It's telling that Ultimate Housing gave evidence that if occupiers could afford more, they didn't choose larger rooms, they chose showers, self-contained showers and WCs. And in this world, care for the self is commercialised. Gyms providing the space for maintenance of the body, coffee bars and pubs the necessary social, albeit commodified space. These people can be understood as what Standing describes as the new precariat, the light infantry of global capitalism. They're not seeking to settle. Instead, they circulate around the country and the world, moving from temporary job to temporary job, or they study. Their aspiration, perhaps, is to join what Standing calls the proficients, those with bundles of skills that they can market, earning high incomes on contracts as consultants or independent own account workers. Their presence in London is part of globalisation that Harvey suggests is a consequence of the synergistic interaction between financial deregulation, technological change, the information revolution and the collapse in cost and time of moving commodities and people. The lure of London and other global cities is extraordinary. Urbanisation, which has been going on for 200 years, is now hyper-urbanisation. This, of course, puts housing in particular under strain. London house prices attract headlines and not just house prices, but rental as well. Rents in London are about 88% higher than the rest of the UK. And the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, estimates that London has the highest population of a growing phenomenon, concealed families, families who live with other families. And information about overcrowding and the numbers on social housing waiting lists underline the dimensions of London's housing crisis, which is further exacerbated by the inequalities inherent in globalisation. There's insufficient time to discuss the full range of government responses to the housing crisis. However, for the purposes of my talk on housing space, the most interesting policy initiatives relate to housing benefit. In particular, a cut to housing benefit, known colloquially as the bedroom tax, has been imposed on those in social housing who are deemed to be under-occupying their homes. Fairness was the key rationale presented by the government for this. For Duncan Smith, the bedroom tax was about getting things back in order, ensuring we don't spend money on things that are unfair. The unfairness he was targeting, he claimed, stemmed from the fact that people on housing benefit in the private rented sector did not receive money for spare bedrooms, and therefore why should those in the social sector? The implementation of the bedroom tax has stimulated an extraordinary amount of activism. Perhaps this is indicative of a broader concern with the apparently arbitrary allocation of housing space by both the state and the market. Tunstall, who's Professor of Housing Policy in York, points out, following a careful analysis of the available data, that after a century of redistribution of housing space in favour of those least generously housed, from the 1990s that trend has been reversed. The most generously housed decile of the population have seen the biggest growth in the housing space allocated to them, while the least generously housed saw no change at all. By 2011, those at the 90th percentile of the distribution of personal housing space had 5 times as much housing as those at the 10th percentile. This very much is down to the decline, well, the rise and then the decline in the building of council and housing association accommodation. The role of social housing has been, in part, the primary tool to reduce housing space inequality. And it's difficult not to see the current redistribution of housing space as political and the most recent cuts in housing benefit as more than an erratic and reflexive response to the financial crisis. My argument is that it's better understood as a carefully coordinated project to intensify the normalisation of contingent and commodified housing for those dependent upon the state. This complements the continued casualisation of labour, entrenches the attractiveness and dominance of London as a global city, and embeds and extends the increasing disparity in wealth between the rich and the poor, and between London and the rest of the UK. Returning to the way in which law regulates this, there's 2 principal ways in which housing providers are forced to provide a minimum amount of housing space. Space requirements, amplified by design guidance for newly built homes, have been imposed by the state via funding regimes. In addition, since the Housing Act of 2004, private landlords have to comply with space requirements that are imposed with the licensing of houses in multiple occupation. The first can be understood as an attempt to provide universal and progressive standards. The second as something more contingent and exceptional, aimed at enhancing the resilience of the most vulnerable. The best known space standards for affordable housing were originally introduced in the 1960s in Homes for Today and Tomorrow and Space in the Home, better known as the Parker-Morris standards. Whilst these were successful at increasing house sizes, they epitomised the top-down social scientific approach to welfare that was derided by Thatcher and were abolished in 1981 as part of a deregulatory drive. They've been replaced by other mechanisms, but the effectiveness of space standard regulation has been questioned. So, for instance, the Greater London Authority adopted a standard described as Parker-Morris Plus during the early 2000s. This was apparently accepted industry-wide, but in a survey of 16,000 dwellings, it was found that between 21% and 55% failed to meet the relevant standards. Now, it's worth making clear that within Europe, it is only in England and Wales that the regulation of minimum housing size is weak. Scotland regulates housing size via building regulation and has done so for 50 years. As a result, their room sizes are bigger than the rest of the UK. And within mainland Europe, room size requirements are regulated via a variety of different tools. But again, the evidence suggests the room sizes are much larger. The current situation in the UK is particularly interesting. From the 1st of October 2015, the UK imposed a nationally described space standard. This sets out minimum gross internal areas for new dwellings, and with requirements that are similar to the GLA standards. So the standard is to apply across all tenures in England and Wales, but the government has made it clear that not only that the new national standards are optional, but they should only be introduced through development plan policies if they address a clearly evidenced need and if their impact on viability of housing construction has been considered alongside the national planning framework. Now, how this will actually play out in practice is unclear, but the exceptional status of this nationally described standard should be noted. It's a standard which is designed to operate as an exception in a country with the smallest houses in Europe and widespread dissatisfaction with the amount of space in people's homes. Moreover, the nationally described space standard has a rather ambivalent political status. It does in effect reduce the role of local politics in the task of rationing housing space. And yet, as I have argued, the distribution of housing space is essentially a political question and one that's felt most acutely at a local level. It also simultaneously makes some sort of political claim to be a national statement of space standards at the same time as it deregulates house building. This ambivalence may prove tricky. Ordinary people and local government are concerned about shrinking sizes, and there are many newspaper headlines which highlight the problem of rabbit hutch living. The second regulatory mechanism is HMO licensing. Now, the interference with the normal freedoms of property owners were justified on the basis of the risks faced by occupiers and the need to raise standards in multi-occupied property. All prescribed HMOs must now be licensed, and licensing includes a number of matters, including kitchen facilities, space, heating requirements. Now, the national standards don't make a reference to room sizes, but the statute enables local authorities to set additional conditions, and those include ones relating to minimum room sizes. Most local authorities have set room size conditions and produce guidance as to their requirements. But there is considerable variation in the room sizes that local authorities will tolerate. So, for instance, Southwark in 2015 set minimum standards of 10 square metres for a single occupancy, where there's a separate kitchen, and 14 square metres for a single occupancy for a room which includes a kitchen. In contrast, Westminster's requirements are 8 square metres and 11 square metres respectively. Now, self-evidently, politics underpins these decisions. London's Labour-controlled authorities tend to set higher requirements for room sizes than Conservative ones. Local authorities are encouraged to reach agreement with landlords about licence conditions, but inevitably, any imposition on a landlord is contentious. Refusal of an HMO licence, including based on room sizes, can be challenged at a tribunal. The legitimacy of local authority room sizes has recently been the subject of consideration by the upper tribunal. What was decided is that it was the first tier tribunal's decision which trumped that of the local authority. This decision is significant. It's another example of the depoliticisation of urban housing space, as it provides that the final determinant of the suitability of space is a specialist tribunal rather than a locally democratically accountable body. Moreover, specialist tribunals face particular difficulties in reaching their decisions when the views of occupiers frequently support landlords' provision. Tribunals are then faced with a particular dilemma. Either they discount the evidence of the occupiers or they accept their evidence, knowing that occupiers are grateful to have found anywhere affordable and decent in which to live. Broader aspirations for adequate housing space surely must be a political decision, better carried out by a democratically accountable local authority rather than a specialist tribunal. So, to conclude, with the dismantling of social housing, the role of other mechanisms such as space standards to protect space allocation becomes ever more important as the demand for urban housing in an era of hyper-urbanisation appears insatiable. I would argue that the mechanisms available in England and Wales demonstrate their inadequacy and unreliability, and more pertinently, their role in depoliticising and making technical what is undoubtedly a political issue. However, there seems little prospect of strengthening that aspect and reasserting a political claim for a more equal redistribution of housing space, when those who are perhaps the ideal urban citizens of the contemporary global economy modify their lives and their bodies so as to collude with the market and express happiness with the housing options they can afford. Nonetheless, the politics of housing space keeps re-emerging and indeed intensifying, particularly in London, where overcrowding, concealed families and rabbit hutch homes, as well as the high costs of housing and housing benefit frequently hit the news. However, perhaps the increasing number of aspiring professions offers some potential for resistance. One of their significant characteristics is their lack of affiliation to place. London needs to keep attracting these mobile workers, otherwise it may lose the economic benefits they bring and even its status as a global city. And if housing quality deteriorates further, perhaps they'll vote with their feet and move to where housing is more attractive and more available. In the long term, it's likely to be this risk that will lead to initiatives protecting housing space for everyone who lives in London and elsewhere in England and Wales. Thank you very much.